Good evening, everybody. If you're wondering why things might feel a little bit disjointed, we've decided this week to flip things upside down. So if you're just like, man, I thought you're supposed to sing in church, that's coming at the end of the service. So we're sort of swinging things around a little bit. Welcome, my name's Mike. I'm pleased to be on staff here at Syndal Baptist Church. And if this is your first time or you've sort of been coming along sort of sporadically throughout, welcome. We really do hope you enjoy your time with us here this evening. We're in, as Simone said before, we're in our final week of our series, How Then Shall We Live? And over the past 2 months, we have been seeking to answer that very question. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, how then are we supposed to live? And we've been basing ourselves in 1 Corinthians, which is looking at a letter that a guy called Paul wrote to a church in a city called Corinth nearly 2,000 years ago. And Paul's inspiration and his motivation in everything that he did was to tell other people about the great news of the gospel and the great life that could be experienced in knowing and following Jesus. And so these past 2 months, we've looked at Paul coaching these Corinthian Christians about issues about unity, temptation, relationships in a life-on-life community, how to be people who speak truth with grace, and dealing with dysfunction. And Paul's letter is not only instructive to the Corinthian Christians in their context, but it's also informative to the characteristics and to the culture and the actions that should define our church as Syndal Baptist. But before we sort of launch into this and before we get started, I feel like we haven't had much time to talk to each other just yet. So what I want you to do is I want you to turn to the person on the left or the right of you, and I want you to share with each other what's the weirdest couple or pet name that you've come across in your experience. You know, pet names like hey babe or honey or muffin or sweet cheeks or whatever you want to know. Have a turn to each other and have a chat about what is the weirdest pet name or couple name that you've come across. I'll give you about 20 seconds to do that. Go ahead. All right, that is about enough sharing time for now. I think it's a really good conversation. Feel free to pick up that conversation afterwards and come up to me and share any weird ones, because I'm always on the lookout for new pet names to call Zoe. I thought we'd have a little bit of a story time to start off tonight. So for Zoe and I, Tuesday nights are date nights. It's one of my favorite nights of the week. And it's probably been one of the single most life-giving and beneficial pieces of advice that Zoe and I were given when we started out dating. Make it a high priority to have a regular date night, even weekly, if possible. And normally, whatever we do, I generally have a good time. Probably about 99% of the time, our date nights are awesome. We won't talk about that other 1% of the time. But one of my favorite things to do on a date night is to do something a little bit adventurous, something a little bit out of the ordinary. That might be just hopping on a train, because growing up in Sunbury, I didn't catch trains that often. So that's an adventure. Hopping on a train and going into the city and trying to find a restaurant or a place to check out. It might be hopping in the car and driving out to Berkey's Lookout up at Mount Dandenong. Or even just simply going for a drive just seeing wherever the road takes us, or the GPS if you're following that. A few weeks ago, we decided to do one of these adventurous sort of dates. And so we hopped on the train, awesome, and went into the city to check out the Queen Victoria night markets. Epic place, epic time. There was sweet as food vans and food trucks everywhere. There was stalls all over the place. We didn't buy anything, but it was cool to check stuff out. Great live music, and what I personally love, just lots and lots of people. It was just so good just to watch people sometimes in sort of a non-weird way. And it was such a good night. That I decided that I just had to share this great experience on Facebook and Instagram. So I took the most hipster-looking photo that I could potentially take on an iPhone, and I uploaded it. And this is the photo with the caption that accompanied it. Date night at #QueenVic Night Market with the hashtag Bay. That is a pet name that Zoe is not too fond of, but I love it. So I use it when I can. Hashtag Bay. Corny, I know, but I was literally just joking around. And as the night progressed, I started getting all these notifications because I was getting likes. I was getting love from my online social friends. It was wicked. And then I got a comment from Sean, who you guys probably know, Sean Tay, and he wrote this. Hashtag Bay. Mike, you're better than this, mate. Fiance, other half, better half, worse half, lady friend, babe, babezilla, all viable options for a man in his 20s. I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. Thanks, Sean. And this was followed up by another mate of mine, Nick, who you guys don't know, but he wrote this literally probably 30 seconds after Sean posted. He said, just about to express my disappointment in the word choice also, but the concern has already been raised. Hashtag pray for Mike. For those of you wondering what the heck the word bae means, it's sort of like urban slang. It's what the cool kids use to refer to someone special, like a girlfriend or a boyfriend, maybe a husband or a wife. I don't know from experience. And some say it's sort of like calling someone sweetie. It's sort of calling someone a babe or any other couple name. Other people say that BAE is actually an acronym. It's a 3-letter acronym, BAE, and it stands for before anyone else. Pretty good, I think. But regardless of what it means, I think I've learnt my lesson based off of first the love, but then also the heat that I copped from my male friends, that hashtag BAE is not a hashtag that I should use anymore to describe the person that I love. And even more so after Googling BAE definition. I did this earlier this week, and it has definitely been confirmed for me that this is a hashtag that I should not use anymore. And that is because the word BAE is also a Danish word, and in Danish, the word BAE literally means poop. Literally means poop. So, I could be in a bit of trouble with that. Isn't it interesting though how such a small word can mean so many different things? Isn't it interesting how such a small word can mean so many different things? And it's the same with the equally small word, love. For us all, the word love just elicits a broad range of responses, feelings, emotions, memories, and experiences. We can say that we love our family, and then in the very next sentence say that we love bacon and eggs. We can say that we love our boyfriend or girlfriend, and we can also say that we love the Essendon footy team. We love our friends, but we also love music, movies, pets, and reading books. When it comes to the word love, our minds are saturated with a million different meanings. Simply put, love is a confusing word. But what does it look like for us to love in our everyday contexts? Who do we love? And is there a limit on love? More importantly, as followers of Jesus, how does our faith inform the way in which we should love? This is a massively important question to answer because Jesus said that love would be the most identifying indicator that we are followers of Jesus, that we are Christians. Let's have a look at what Jesus said about the importance of love. Talking to his 12 closest mates, he said this, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." The way in which we love is the biggest indicator to the world that we are disciples of Jesus. The way in which we love is the biggest indicator to the world that we are followers of Jesus. The way in which we love is the biggest indicator to the world that we are Christians. And so the question for us tonight to answer is this. As Christians, what does real love look like? As Christians, what does real love look like? And as we delve into tackling this question and as we open our Bibles, let's first stop, pray, and ask God to inform our minds, to touch our hearts, and most importantly, to change our lives. So would you pray with me? God, we ask that in this time together tonight, that you would challenge, encourage, and point us to a better way of life. God, please speak specifically to us as we explore what it means to be a follower of Jesus and what real love looks like in our lives tonight. We ask these things in your name. Amen. All right, if you've brought your Bibles or you've got an iPhone, flick to or open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And while you're going there, or if you don't have anything, it'll be up on the screen as well. Last week, Jess Lockhart spoke on the topic of playing your part, our second last week in this series, and she was looking at Paul's teachings on spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the chapter before where we are tonight. And she looked at the varying roles that we all have as part of a church community. And Jess showed us how spiritual gifts are all about Jesus and what he gives us to use for his purposes. And she left us with these 4 points: that we are all gifted, we are all equal, we are all together, and as we use our gifts and play our part in church community, we are all for Jesus. And Jess left us on a bit of a cliffhanger last week, because at the very end of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul writes this: "But now, let me show you a way of life that is best of all, better than anything else than he has already spoken about. The way of life that is best of all." What is this way of life? And it's important to note at this point that Paul uses like a Greek word, it's called hodos, and it's used to describe this word, the way. This way of life that is best of all. And this very same word was used throughout the New Testament to describe, as a euphemism, a description of the early church, of the community of the followers of Jesus. If you look in the New Testament book of Acts, for instance, Christians weren't identified as being Christians. They were identified as being part of the way. Disciples and followers of Jesus who lived a vastly countercultural lifestyle together in community. And so Paul, as he is about to launch into one of the most famous written pieces on love that we know today, Paul reminds the Corinthian Christians that love is the biggest indicator to the world that they are followers of Jesus, that they are part of this, the way. And this is something that the Corinthian Christians had obviously struggled with. They struggled with this concept and idea of what love looks like in church community. Paul, in the chapters leading up to 1 Corinthians 13, has addressed issues which plagued the Corinthian church, particularly when they were all gathered together corporately, sort of like how we are gathered here tonight. There were issues with the way in which people dressed, the way in which they worshipped. There was a socio-economic divide which created a social hierarchy of different levels within the church. And finally, there appears to have been sort of an elevation of certain spiritual gifts over others, so that if you had a better spiritual gift, that made you a better person than someone who had a least better spiritual gift. In essence, the bottom line of the Corinthian church, the bottom line issue was that through valuing certain things and certain people, others were excluded. People who were different were excluded. And the people on the margins of the church were left out on the fringe. The church had an exclusive culture, not an inclusive culture. This was a church that was divided. This was a church that lacked love. The Corinthian church ultimately didn't have a high view of love and a role that the love plays in church community. So Paul, in this chapter, sets about reorienting what the Corinthian Christians should value most. And love comes out on top. Let's read together Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1. Paul writes, "If I could speak all the languages of earth and of angels, but didn't love others, I would only be a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I had the gift of prophecy, and if I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all knowledge, and if I had such faith that I could move mountains but didn't love others, I would be nothing. If I gave everything I have to the poor and even sacrificed my body, I could boast about it. But if I didn't love others, I would have gained nothing. Paul here really frames how our motivations are at the center of what we do. Our motivations are at the heart of our actions, and the value of our actions are ultimately determined by our motivations. In the context of the Corinthian church, although their actions seemed to be quite spectacular, their motivation lacked love. For Paul, phenomenal spiritual gifts and actions, like being able to speak in tongues, being able to prophesy, having all knowledge, having incredible faith, outstanding generosity, even self-sacrifice to the extent of losing one's love, all of these amazing, spectacular things, without the common denominator of love, was worth nothing. If love is not the driving motivation behind what we do as followers of Jesus, then what we do is ultimately done for nothing. Our motivations are at the heart of our actions. Our motivations matter. But the big question asked at the outset of tonight still remains. As Christians, what does real love look like? Paul, in part, answers this question in the following few verses. These are probably some of the most famous verses in this passage, because they describe love and what it is. It's not an exhaustive list, but nevertheless, it sets the bar pretty high. It sets a pretty high standard and precedence for what real love looks like in the church. And so for these verses, I thought, because they're so familiar and because we've heard them quite a lot of the time, let's all read them together out loud, nice and slowly, and think upon what real love looks like. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 to 7, it's up on the screen, and let's all read out loud together in somewhat of a coordinated fashion. So let's read this, hey? Let's start from verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. Hey, that was a good job. Well done, everybody. Now, these six sentences have permeated throughout not just church culture, but throughout the world. I mean, just think about it. At Christian and secular weddings, it's not uncommon to hear these verses read out. And the picture of love which is sort of presented here is mind-blowing. It's amazing. It's awesome. Paul personifies love, describing it not by the way of adjectives like love is warm and fuzzy, but rather through verbs in terms of its behavior. And it's interesting to note, just a side fact, that Paul spends more time on what love does not do than what it does do. But as we consider these verses that we've all just read out loud, and as we've all probably heard a million times before, what begins to sink in for me is that this picture of love sounds hard. This picture of love doesn't really have like a lovey-dovey, touchy-feely vibe going on about it. This picture of love sounds like it requires action. And this picture of love sounds permanent, almost like it doesn't change depending on who the person is or whether you're having a good or a bad day. Now, I love trying to find loopholes in the Bible because it just means sometimes that the standard maybe isn't so high. But Paul doesn't leave us with any in these verses. This description of love is a love that continues forever. I mean, let's just consider verse 7. It says that love never gives up, it never loses faith, it is always hopeful, and it endures through every circumstance. If I'm to be honest with you tonight, it leaves me thinking this. Really, God? I mean, surely there's some fine print somewhere. Surely this standard of love doesn't apply across the board. I mean, like, I can understand if it relates to a husband or a wife or maybe even family. And at most, maybe some of my friends, the ones that don't have issues. But you're telling me that this is the standard of love which is to define the whole church community? What about the people that I don't like? Do I have to love the people that I don't even like? I think that if we all here tonight were to get brutally honest with each other, just for a second, just here for tonight, it stays in this room, we would all admit that there are people that we struggle to get along with here in church. People maybe that we don't even like. Maybe it's because that person is too loud, or that person is too quiet, or maybe that person is rude, or they're just rough. Maybe they're too Pentecostal, they're just all over the shop when the music's playing. Maybe they're super conservative and they're just so stiff. Maybe that person is too old, or maybe this person is too young and immature. Or you can just insert your reason here. There are people who individually we don't like that still come to this same church as us. So how are we supposed to love them when we don't even like them? Although there's so many different sermons that could be done on these verses tonight, we could spend weeks packing it through. It's such a rich passage. I just want to focus on one point to address this question and to address this tension. How do we love people that we maybe don't like? At the start of verse 7, Paul writes this: love never gives up. Other translations say love bears all things. Other translations say it always protects. And the last one, which you can't see, says this: it puts up with anything. All of these translations are of the same word, the same phrase. And it's a verb which Paul is the only New Testament writer to use in the entire New Testament. And he uses it only 3 other times out of all the other content that he wrote in the Bible. And in every single situation, this word, this phrase means the same thing. It means to bear up against difficulties. It means to cover all things. For instance, to cover things, to love regardless of any unpleasantness of other people. What Paul is saying here is that love never gives up on people, no matter how annoying they are. Love bears all things, no matter the inconvenience or the unpleasantness. Love always protects, even when it is difficult. For Paul, love puts up with whatever junk, mess, and dysfunction that people present with. Real love, in the context of Christian community, is not exclusive, but rather it's inclusive. Real love doesn't leave people out on the margins or on the fringes. Real love brings everyone into the center of the fold. The bottom line is this: real love leads us to a more inclusive life in Christian community. Real love leads us to a more inclusive life in Christian community. Does this mean that we turn a blind eye and affirm sinful behaviours, actions, or lifestyle? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that we welcome everyone and that we never give up on them, regardless of where they're at on their journey to Jesus. Real love leads us to a more inclusive life in Christian community. And so for us here tonight, let me just ask you one uncomfortable question, just one. Who is it in this church community at Syndal Baptist that you struggle to love? Who is it in this church community at Syndal Baptist that you struggle to love? Who is the person whose personality or attitude or behavior or maybe cultural background or even physical appearance leads you to avoid them? Who are the people that you ignore or fail to engage with for any number of reasons? Who are the people that you avoid in this church? Who are the people from this church that you have never spoken to, welcomed in, or invited to join your social circle? Who is it in this church community at Syndal Baptist that you struggle to love? Whoever comes to mind, and someone will come to mind because we're human. Let's not cover it up. Someone comes to mind that we all struggle with. The challenge for us all is to work out ways in which we can grow in our love for them. Because love is all about an action, it's a behavior, it's not an emotion. Real love leads us to a more inclusive life in Christian community. And maybe you're wondering about why we should take up this challenge. Why should we do the hard yards? Why should we put up with unpleasantness and be uncomfortable in order to love those people that we struggle to love the most? Why should we step up to the plate and try our very best to live lives filled with real love? Well, let's just consider for a few minutes the real love that Jesus displayed for us, for each and every single one of us. Because when you gave God every reason to reject you, he pursued you. And when we gave God every reason to pull away his love from us, he did the exact opposite. We read in Romans 5:8, but God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. When we were at our most unlovable, God chose to love us. When we were at our most unpleasant and uncomfortable and fully opposed to God, God chose to love us. It's incredible, incredible news. And so with Jesus as our example, we love others because he first loved us. Real love leads us to more inclusive life in Christian community. So one last time that we hear this uncomfortable question. Who is it in this church community at Syndal Baptist that you struggle to love? Who is that person? And I just want you to imagine with me for a second. Just imagine, what would this church look like if we were to continue to love everyone with a real love, as described here in 1 Corinthians 13? What would this church look like if people who were on the margins, who were on the fringes of our church community, were continually brought into the fold? If we were to continue to live our lives full of real love, then people in this church as well as people outside of the church would look at this church community and see that we are very clearly followers of Jesus. Because the way in which we love is the most obvious indicator that we are actually followers of Jesus. And imagine a Christian community of passionate, on-fire Jesus followers. Imagine the impact that would have on this region. Just like Christian communities all over the world continue to change this world with radical acts of love. In just a few minutes, the band is about to come up. And we're going to be heading, as was sort of mentioned off the start, we're going to be heading into an extended time of worship through music. And these songs that we're about to sing are phenomenal. They're great, great songs because they sing all about the love that God has had for us. The incredible love which God has extended and shown to us faithfully, even though we were horrible people to love. And as we sing about how God has loved us so extravagantly and so enduringly, let's just consider for a second how we might maybe mirror the love that God has shown us through the way in which we love others. In particular, maybe that person that we struggle to love the most here at church. If anything that has occurred tonight or may occur in the next sort of 15, 20 minutes of music, if anything has occurred that has moved you or leaves you with questions or you just need to have a chat about someone, during the music set, just nudge the person next to you and just whisper, let's talk. And maybe you want to take opportunities to talk here or talk at the end of the service. Alternatively, a bunch of the staff would be more than happy to have a chat with you. Chris and Fiona, Adam, come and have a chat with me as well if you'd like. But for now, let's just close in prayer and consider how we might live a life of real love in this Christian community, in this church, Syndal Baptist Church, and how our love might show others that we are followers of Jesus. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for this incredible, reassuring, and continual way that you love us, even though we find ourselves choosing to love other things over you. Help us through your Holy Spirit to come to a stage where we love you more than anything else. And as we love you more wholeheartedly every day, would you help us to love others the way that we should? Lord, I pray that you would speak to us in this time as we sing about your incredible love and the way in which you have shown it to us. And I just pray for these things in your precious name.